Welcome to the deep dive. So the sources you've sent over for this one, they really seem to hone in on this single frustrating gap.
They really do. It's that space between what a policy is meant to do.
And what people actually do in their real lives. It explains why so many policies, policies with great intentions just seem to hit a brick wall.
Exactly. And today we are digging into this foundational belief
Yeah.
that really sabotages so much of this. It's the idea that human behavior is basically a switch you can just flip.
All right. The model seems so simple.
It's so clean, isn't it? You spot a problem, you write a rule, you enforce it, and poof, problem solved. It's a blueprint that feels competent. It's comforting, both for the politicians and for the public that's demanding action.
But the sources make it so clear that people just aren't pieces on a chessboard.
No, they adapt, they interpret, they find workarounds. And any policy that starts by assuming you can just control behavior like that,
Yeah.
well, it's already on the back foot.
So our mission today is to really dissect why that assumption is so flawed, and more importantly, what happens when we confuse seeing a behavior more often with it actually, growing.
That's the crucial part.
Okay, so let's start there with that flawed foundation, that simple policy model problem, rule solved. It's so appealing. Why is it so hard for policymakers to get past that idea that total control is even possible?
Well, because control is comforting, right, and complexity is, frankly, terrifying. Policy really relies on this illusion of predictability. But the second a new rule hits the real world, human unpredictability just kicks right in. People don't just absorb a rule as it's written.
No, they filter it through their own life, their own needs.
Exactly. Self-interest, necessity, circumstance.
Uh-huh.
If a new rule makes doing X harder, they don't just stop. They immediately invent Y, or they just move X a little bit to the side.
That's the workaround.
That's the workaround. And that localized adaptive response is the very first, often silent point of failure for this kind of predictable policy.
That makes perfect sense. The policy is rigid, but people are fluid. So if that roadmap breaks down right away, how do these, legitimate concerns escalate into what feels like a sudden crisis? Because the sources suggest it's more of an amplification loop.
Right. It's not a sudden surge in the actual behavior itself, usually. It rarely starts with hysteria or a lie. It's much more ordinary.
So how does it start?
An issue, maybe a very real problem, gets noticed locally. Someone sees something negative in their community. Concerns are raised, people talk, usually with people who already kind of see the world the same way.
Okay.
Stories get shared, examples pass back and forth, and language used to describe the problem naturally gets a little tighter, a bit more emphatic. And at that stage, it all feels very reasonable.
And then I'm guessing it starts to gather attention. The sources talk about how the issue then moves through these reinforcing channels, social media echo chambers, sympathetic news outlets.
Political campaigns that, benefit from a sense of urgency.
Right. And isolated cases suddenly get lumped together. And what was a rare edge case is now presented as the everyday reality.
And this is where the psychology really takes over. The sources bring up a concept that I think anyone who's ever shopped for a car will immediately get. It's called the new car effect.
Oh, I know this one. You decide you want a red SUV.
And suddenly you see red SUVs everywhere.
Everywhere. They were invisible before, but now your brain is just constantly flagging them.
It's not that a million new red SUVs just appeared overnight. It's that your cognitive filter changed. Your brain prioritized that pattern.
So once an issue is on our collective radar, we start seeing it everywhere, too.
We notice it more, we remember every single instance of it, and we talk about it more. And this increased observation creates the powerful subjective feeling that the behavior is growing exponentially.
Even if the actual rate hasn't changed at all.
Even if it's completely stable. And the sources argue this is the core psychological mistake behind so many policy blunders, mistaking visibility for actual growth.
So a lot of these behaviors that trigger panic are actually long-standing things that have just become easier to see and name.
Precisely. They're being highlighted by a newly focused media or political lens.
But I have to push back a little here, based on what I read. I mean, sometimes behavior does genuinely spike, right? Because of economic shifts or social changes. How do the sources say we can tell the difference? How do we respond to a real increase without just panicking?
That is the absolute critical distinction. A rational response needs data, context, proportionality. But the moment that psychological amplification grabs hold, the second we mistake seeing more for there being more urgency, just completely trumps curiosity.
And that's the tipping point.
Yeah, it's the tipping point. The language just shifts. It goes from this is a concern to this is getting out of control. Headlines get punchier, nuance evaporates. all the complexity gets sanded down.
The sources describe that moment where the people involved stop being seen as individuals. They just become the problem.
Their motives are assumed, any complexity is just dismissed. And that whole transformation is what leads directly into a moral panic.
Okay, so the moral panic. This is where a behavior, which might be stable, is suddenly reframed.
Aggressively reframed
Yes.
as an existential threat, a sign of moral decline, or, a crisis that must be stopped right now.
And the consequence for actually making good policy here is, it's dire.
It's terrible because urgency has replaced curiosity. Policies aren't judged anymore on whether they actually work. They're judged on how loudly they signal disapproval.
It's about performative outrage, not efficacy.
Yes. And at that point, anyone who dares to ask the practical question like, okay, but if we pass this law, what happens next? What are the unintended consequences? They risk sounding like they're minimizing the crisis.
Or even defending the bad behavior.
And that's the moment policy stops learning. That pressure cooker environment guarantees that the response is always the same. Clamp down, do it fast, tighten the rules, sharpen the penalties. The goal is to make the behavior disappear.
But the whole point of our deep dive today is that it doesn't disappear.
It just moves.
And the sources spend a lot of time on the costs of that move into the dark.
They do. Once a behavior is criminalized or pushed underground by panic, it just loses any visible, monitored structure it might have had. It moves into the shadows. And that move has devastating social costs.
So what do those shadows actually look like? Where does the behavior go?
Well, it fragments.
Yeah.
Instead of happening in a monitored space, it shifts to informal, totally unregulated setups. Think about a black market. There's no quality control, zero consumer protection, and definitely no tax revenue.
Right.
You also get new workarounds designed specifically to avoid getting caught, which ironically just increases the sophistication of the criminal side of things.
And the sources really highlighted the effect on power dynamics.
That's maybe the most insidious cost of all. When a behavior becomes desperate and clandestine, the power imbalance between the person providing the illegal service and the person who needs it just explodes.
Because there's no legal recourse, no one to call.
Absolutely nothing. That shifts all the power to criminal intermediaries. It increases the risk of violence, exploitation, abuse, all the things the original policy was probably trying to prevent in the first place.
So the state hasn't actually fixed the problem, it's just delayed its own involvement, and now it has to deal with it later at a much higher cost. Higher enforcement, more people in prison, bigger social service burdens.
All while the behavior continues, just in a darker, more damaging form. The costs don't vanish, they just resurface somewhere more toxic. It is the definition of a backfiring policy cycle.
Which brings us to the big question that so often gets dodged in these debates. If clamping down just pushes problems underground, what actually works better? Panic or prevention?
And the evidence, when you pull together the data from public health, from safeguarding, from long-term crime reduction, it all points overwhelmingly towards prevention strategies. The sources really focus on approaches that prioritize system stability over, moral judgment.
Let's break those down. We hear the phrase early intervention all the time, but what does that actually look like in practice here?
Well, panic is reactive. It punishes the behavior after it's visible. Prevention is proactive. It means designing systems to spot risk factors like housing instability, untreated mental health issues, educational failure, and stepping in before those things force someone into high-risk behavior just to survive.
So it's about building buffers, not just bigger walls.
Exactly.
The sources also talk a lot about visibility over secrecy, which seems completely counterintuitive. The impulse is always to clean up the streets, make the problem invisible.
It is counterintuitive, but it's critical. When behaviors are visible, they can be monitored. They can be understood. You can have social oversight. If you want a system that catches problems before they become crises, then the problems have to be out in the light where you can see them and apply resources.
And clamping down does the opposite. It creates secrecy, which prevents any kind of helpful intervention.
And it allows those dangerous power imbalances to just flourish completely undetected.
There's a really profound point in the material about how high-risk behaviors decline over the long term. It says it's not usually because the laws got tougher. It's because people could genuinely imagine a tomorrow. That feels like a totally different policy mindset.
It completely changes the calculus of risk. If you are facing an immediate, impossible need for shelter, for food, a short-term, high-risk choice can seem perfectly rational.
Of course.
So when the sources talk about effective prevention, they're talking about building that foundational stability. They call it systems design.
And what are the key components of that systems design?
They list them pretty clearly.
Mm.
Realistic job prospects that actually pay a living wage.
Yeah.
Guaranteed access to healthcare, both physical and mental. Genuinely stable housing, not just short-term fixes. An education system that actually opens up a future.
And safety nets people can trust.
Yes, social safety nets that people feel they can actually rely on without feeling shame or having to navigate some impossible bureaucracy.
So the behavior itself declines because the environment has changed. The high-risk choice becomes less necessary, or at least less appealing. It isn't about being permissive.
Not at all. It's about providing an infrastructure that makes stable, positive choices more feasible than the negative ones. When you solve the underlying crisis of need, you often solve the behavioral crisis at the same time.
You're treating the disease, not just the symptom.
Precisely.
So if we bring this all together, how do we reframe this conversation? For policymakers and for us, as listeners watching all this play out, it sounds like step one is just accepting a really difficult truth.
It is. Human behavior is a powerful constant, and it adapts way faster than any law we can write.
Now, once we accept that, the whole policy debate has to shift.
It shifts from the impossible goal, which is eliminating the behavior, to the practical one. How do we manage this behavior to minimize the harm it causes?
Which gives us a much clearer choice. When we see a new regulation being debated, instead of asking if it will stop the behavior, we should be asking the systems design question.
Right. Given that this behavior is going to exist in some form anyway, do we want it happening out in the open, with oversight and a chance to intervene?
Or do we want to force it into the shadows, where exploitation and hidden higher costs are pretty much guaranteed?
And the sources are very clear on this. Accepting reality is not a moral surrender. It's the first step to being effective. The second we stop designing policies for these idealized spreadsheet people and start designing them for real, complicated, adaptable humans.
The whole conversation changes. It stops being about who is morally right and starts being about what actually works to reduce harm.
Yes.
This whole analysis, it explains so much of what we see on a loop in public life, why criminalization so often backfires, why enforcement budgets just keep getting bigger, and why the same problems seem to pop up again and again, decade after decade. It's a systemic failure, really, rooted in a basic psychological error.
And what's really fascinating, I think, is the political impulse it reveals. If this failure is a constant, if expanding enforcement while outcomes stagnate is a guaranteed result of this panic cycle, what is that deeper, enduring human impulse that drives us, especially our leaders, to keep prioritizing the signal of disapproval over measurable effectiveness? That's the thought I think you should carry forward the next time you see a headline about a new ban or another crackdown.